Any military commander who is honest with himself or with those he's speaking to will admit that he has made mistakes in the application of military power. He's killed people unnecessarily through mistakes, through errors of judgment. 100 or thousands or tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000. But he hasn't destroyed nations.
For 13 days in October 1962, the fate of the world hung in the balance as the United States, led by President John F. Kennedy, and the Soviet Union, under Premier Nikita Khrushchev, faced off in a dangerous confrontation known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. With the introduction of Soviet nuclear missiles to Cuba, a simmering conflict between the countries soon boiled into a full-blown crisis. Despite numerous opportunities to initiate nuclear war, Kennedy and Khrushchev desperately sought a way out of the crisis and reached a compromise. But while history remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis as just 13 days in October 1962, the conflict began many years before, with its roots in the relationships between the US, Soviet Union, and the island country of Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The conflict between the United States and Cuba originated in early 1959, when revolutionary Fidel Castro overthrew Fulgencio Batista, the US-backed leader of Cuba. To undermine the Castro regime, the Central Intelligence Agency began to use covert methods, such as the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion. Authorized by Kennedy in 1961, the CIA trained and armed Cuban exiles to infiltrate Cuba, hoping to spark an uprising. Despite US involvement, the invasion was a complete failure, and most of the CIA-trained rebels were captured or killed. On the other side of the world, the antagonism between the United States and the Soviet Union centered around the city of Berlin. At the time, a compromise had separated post-war Germany into a western half, controlled by the United States and its allies, and an eastern half controlled by the Soviets. Berlin, located deep inside East Germany, had likewise been separated into a west and east. But conflict arose as the Soviets had made attempts to take over West Berlin. In 1958, Khrushchev delivered what many interpreted as an ultimatum for the removal of Western forces from Berlin. The US refused to leave. To deter a Soviet attack, the US deployed Jupiter nuclear ballistic missiles in Turkey, from where they threatened the Soviet Union. Some view this move as provocative and destabilizing. Due to the US nuclear superiority and the fact that the Jupiter missiles were best suited for a first strike, the Soviets believed that the US favored a nuclear preemptive attack. The catalyst for the crisis itself was the secret agreement between Castro and Khrushchev to deploy nuclear missiles to Cuba in the summer of 1962. Both sides had their motivations. For the Cubans, the American-backed Bay of Pigs invasion led Castro to fear that the US would mount another attack on Cuba. The introduction of nuclear missiles to Cuba will help deter such an attack. As for the Soviets, the Cuban missiles would help deter an American attack on Cuba or the Soviet Union. Additionally, the missiles could be used to bargain for Berlin. But while both leaders agreed to install the nuclear missiles, Castro and Khrushchev disagreed about the purpose of the missiles. Khrushchev, in a memoir, stated that he never intended to use the missiles. They were in Cuba solely to deter an attack. Castro, on the other hand, was prepared to launch in the face of a US attack. On October 16, 1962, the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis began as aerial reconnaissance photos revealed the presence of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. President Kennedy and his advisors, referred to as the Executive Committee, or EXCOM, agreed that the Cuban missiles were a serious threat and resolved to remove them. But among the members, there were different views about the nature of that threat. Led by General Curtis LeMay, Kennedy's top military advisors perceived the Cuban missiles as an imminent threat to the nation. LeMay wanted a quick way to destroy these missiles and pressured Kennedy to implement a first option, airstrike and invasion.
General Curtis LeMay was saying, let's go in, let's totally destroy Cuba.
Other advisors viewed the missiles as a political threat and worried about Kennedy's reputation. These advisors suggested pure diplomacy as an alternative to an attack. Kennedy faced a difficult choice, attack or bargain. Neither option was perfect. Attacking would pressure the Soviets to respond with military force in a place such as Berlin, and the conflict could escalate into nuclear war, which would mean the deaths of millions of people. On the other hand, negotiation would inevitably result in political losses in places such as Berlin. Additionally, diplomacy would seem weak and damage Kennedy's reputation. On October 22nd, after days of deliberation, Kennedy alerted the nation to the presence of the Cuban missiles and announced his course of action: a blockade. This blockade was a compromise between an attack and diplomacy, a solution that avoided both escalation of the conflict and the loss of reputation. As events played out over the next few days, emotions wavered between hope and despair. A low point came on October 27th when a US U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, its pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, killed. American blood had been spilled, and ExComm prepared to initiate military action within days. Most importantly, however, ExComm received two conflicting letters from Khrushchev. The first, conciliatory letter, offered to pull the Soviet missiles out of Cuba if the US pledged never to invade Cuba. A hostile second letter demanded that the US remove the Jupiter missiles and pledge not to invade Cuba in a compromise for the removal of the Cuban missiles. The crucial dilemma facing ExComm was how to respond to the two contradictory proposals. A solution was proposed by former ambassador for Soviet affairs, Llewellyn Thompson, who personally knew Khrushchev. Thompson suggested that Kennedy respond to the conciliatory message and ignore the hostile message.
In Thompson's mind was this thought: Khrushchev's gotten himself in a hell of a fix. He would then think to himself, my God, if I can get out of this with a deal that I can say to the Russian people, Kennedy was going to destroy Castro, and I prevented it. Thompson, knowing Khrushchev as he did, thought Khrushchev will accept that.
Using Thompson's solution, the U.S. response publicly ignored the terms of the hostile second letter and instead responded to the first conciliatory message. However, President Kennedy sent his brother and Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, to privately convey to the Soviets that the U.S. will remove its Jupiter missiles, in addition to a pledge not to invade Cuba. The Soviet response came the next day, October 28th. Satisfied with the secret deal, Khrushchev acknowledged the U.S. public offer, ending the Cuban Missile Crisis. During the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union and the United States teetered precariously on the edge of nuclear war. What brought both countries back from the brink and made compromise possible? First, both leaders chose compromise over conflict. At multiple points throughout the crisis, both leaders had reasons to launch nuclear weapons, but they didn't. Both Khrushchev and Kennedy feared the destructive consequences of nuclear war and understood that a single mistake could mean the deaths of millions. This fear influenced many of their choices during the crisis, such as Kennedy's decision to initiate a blockade. Kennedy was also influenced by the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, where Kennedy chose conflict over compromise by ordering an invasion. Choosing to initiate conflict was a mistake that Kennedy was determined not to repeat during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The second factor was the concept of empathy.
We must try to put ourselves inside their skin and look at us through their eyes, just to understand the thoughts that lie behind their decisions and their actions.
Through empathy, Thompson understood Khrushchev's wants and motives and crafted a response that was acceptable to both Kennedy and Khrushchev. Many historians agree that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest we have ever come to World War III. But beyond this, the Cuban Missile Crisis had a profound impact on history. The precarious situation during the crisis led both the Soviet Union and the United States to rethink the nuclear arms race. These were the first steps towards the first compromises of the Cold War. Today, there are many parallels between the Cuban Missile Crisis and the current situation with North Korea. The lessons from the crisis teach us that empathy, along with choosing compromise over conflict, is essential for a peaceful resolution.